So that's, as I said earlier, that's one of the initial problems here. I look at this, you set this thing up, all right, it's going to be the pre-1933 Federal Reserve redeemable currency, and the currency is now going to be some digital unit. Wonderful. What happens when one of these countries decides to play games?
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and this is the Miles Franklin Weekly Special for July 17th through July 24th, 2023, while supplies last. And on this one, supplies may not last long. Because this week we feature 2023 American Silver Eagles at just $9.49 over spot, our lowest price on Silver Eagles in more than a year. Since its first release almost 40 years ago, the Silver Eagle has been, without exception, the world's most popular bullion coin, which provides unparalleled recognizability and liquidity. It's 3/9 fine, comes 22 a tube, 500 to a box, and is available at just $9.49 over spot while supplies last. Finally, the Silver Eagle is IRA eligible. And if you'd like to learn more about a precious metals IRA, call us, and we'll be happy to help you in that process. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. We're always privileged to have this distinguished returning guest. Dr. Edwin Vieira is not only a constitutional attorney, but an expert with published works on constitutional money and why it is essential and part of the foundation of this country for us to have sound money for the good of the people. He is the author of the book Pieces of Eight, The Monetary Powers and Disabilities of the United States Constitution, which was most recently published as a Gold Money Foundation special edition in January 1st, 2011. He's here with us today on Liberty and Finance. Dr. Vieira, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Duncan.
We were wanting to get you back on because there was recently in the past week or so an announcement, actually a sort of a leaked pre-announcement from Russia of an upcoming piece of extremely important and impactful news to be coming out of their upcoming conference with other BRICS nations in South Africa next month in August. And that is the announcement of a gold-linked currency for international trade settlement. We wanted to get you on to discuss the importance of this in your eyes and where this falls in the sequence of events that have led the United States away from a constitutionally backed hard money, gold or silver-backed currency. And if you could give us your view of this proposal that evidently is supported by approximately 50%, or nations representing 50% of the world's population and more than 50% of the world's GDP. So it's evidently quite a major event that's going to be occurring, and wanted to get your view on the impact of it and the basis of it, and whether or not you see a role for the U.S. or the Western countries who have departed from our sound money foundations in this going forward.
Well, let's start with number one. Is there a role for them in this BRICS operation? And the answer, I would say, at the present time, at least in the United States, is no. The United States wants to maintain, the United States, the people in control. And the people in control are not the politicians, right? The people really behind the financial system in this country want to maintain their position with the so-called dollar, the Federal Reserve note unit, as the world reserve currency. So this BRICS proposal, whatever it might be, doesn't foresee that continuing, right? If the United States comes into this system, it will participate in whatever the new BRICS currency might be, or it would have to make the Federal Reserve System compatible in some way, right, in terms of being exchangeable according to whatever the rules that come out of the BRICS system might be. Well, that now puts the Federal Reserve System or the United States financial system as simply one of a number of units within this larger structure. And it's the structure, whatever its currency unit might be, I guess they would assume, the people who are setting it up, would become the world reserve currency or the premier trading currency in the world. So that's number one. I think we have to look at the unlikelihood that the United States is going to want to come into this thing as one among equals, if you will use that conception, right? That it's simply kind of a situation where all these countries are involved in a Federal Reserve, say, would, like a Federal Reserve system on the international scale, right? And the countries are now like the regional Federal Reserve banks within our country, and we have one currency in this new BRICS system, and the Federal Reserve is one of many international banks, or national banks, if you will, that are participants in the system. So I think, no, that's not going to happen. They're going to try to fight that in some way. There's some kind of currency war, trade war, whatever, or other kind of war, if you know what I mean. So that's number one. But going to the concept, without denigrating these people, because it's not clear exactly what they know and what they want to do, I'm always leery of the concept of a gold-backed currency. What the heck does that mean? All right. Under our constitutional system, if it were running properly, the currency would be actually gold and silver, but let's just say gold. Make it simple. It would be a piece of gold, a weight of gold. All right. That's the currency. There's no backing to that whatsoever. There's nothing behind that. That's where the buck stops, to use Truman's phrase, right? It stops at this piece of real metal, certain fixed weight. And then there might be generated out of that digital currencies, let's say, or paper currencies of the old Federal Reserve System, right? That is paper currency that represented a bank debt which could be reified, if you will, paid, redeemed was the term they used in the statute, for a certain weight of gold, which at the time of the Federal Reserve was the 1900 statute, and it was $20.67 per ounce. And you can work back and see how many troy grains there were in that system. All right. So that was not a backed system in any way, unless you were looking at the central bank being the real money. And then there was this other thing over here, the gold, which they promised to pay. And that was the great fallacy of all these systems. That's the trick. First, you start off with what was really the constitutional structure. There was gold and silver of certain weights. Silver, you had dollars. Gold, they called them eagles because they weren't dollars. They were very realistic people. And then the banks were playing this game of putting out their own notes, debt instruments, promises to pay, which were redeemable or payable in some number of these gold or silver units. And the problem was people always tended to look to those paper currencies, really in the old days paper currencies, and then more recently you could do it in terms of a digital system, as the currency. That was the money, and it had this backing to it. Well, that was the trick, because once you set up that system, at some stage you could remove the backing, because people were used to using the paper currency, or they were used to writing checks, or they were used to whatever, this other thing, this debt instrument. And that's what happened in 1933. Right, the system comes along with Federal Reserve required to maintain a certain amount of gold to pay these debts that it had in terms of the paper currency that it was emitting. And in league with Roosevelt, it said, well, we're now taking away the backing. Oh, there was fraud number one. And that was domestically, and then eventually they did it internationally as well in 1973 under Nixon. That was the trick. Now, I suppose if you were working this in reverse, you would say, all right, let's go back to a system of backed currency, and then we'll move further and further into a system of real, say, here in the United States, constitutional currency. So I look at the BRICS thing, and I say, well, that's an attempt to give the world within this system something that looks like 1930 pre-1933 in the United States. There's going to be some unit floating around out there digitally, we'll assume. Maybe it'll be reified in actual paper currency, maybe not. And this is backed in the sense that at some point in the system, by some mechanism, the holders of these digital or paper units will be able actually to receive real gold. They'll go to some authority which will redeem those units somehow in gold. And so we're now in a pre-1933, the analogy, pre-1933 Federal Reserve type system. Well, what happened to the Federal Reserve type system? Right. It's not a stable system unless you can put very strict controls on the issuer of these paper or digital units. Now, it's probably better than the Federal Reserve system we have now, but I don't look at that and say, oh, well, that's the panacea, that's the solution for our problem. It isn't. It takes us back to a system that we know failed. And it was a system that didn't have the problem of multiple countries. Right? They set up the Federal Reserve System because they wanted to have control over the banks within one country. So we didn't have different kinds of pressures that weren't susceptible to a single legal system. Right? All the banks in this country, mostly national banks in this country, were all subjected to the same National Banking Act coming out of the Civil War. And that didn't work because of currency expansion. But it was all within one legal system. Well, within one country. And there was no way that Minnesota or Texas or Maryland could opt out of that system, right? Or threaten in some way to opt out of that system. Whereas, of course, this thing that they're proposing is multinational. And so you have that problem on top of the normal instabilities of any kind of fractional reserve system, is you have the political instability that the various countries might have an incentive to, some way remove themselves or put some kind of political pressure on. So I leave that aside. Look at that and I say, well, there's a can of worms you probably don't want to open. But let's assume that you wanted to set up this kind of a system and you wanted to have what I would consider an actually sound currency. And it's going to be gold. That's what they choose. They're going to use gold. Well, the solution is very simple. You set up some kind of a depository for holding the actual gold, and maybe more than one, because that would provide you probably in the long run with more security. And you want it to be digital. Let's say, okay, that's fine. And you settle on a unit. Let's say the Troy grain, and you make it digital in the sense that all the transactions can occur digitally, but there's actual gold in a repository of some kind, depository. And the customers of this system are the owners of that gold. There's no intermediary. It's not as when you go to a bank today, if you put gold, we were dealing in the old days, if you were dealing with gold coins, put the gold coins across the teller's window into the bank, and at that moment the gold coins become the money of the bank. The bank owns it. And your checking account, savings account, whatever, that's just a debt the bank owes you. It becomes the bank's money, not your money. And you're running around with a bank debt that you hope someone will take. Federal Reserve note is an example. Right? Well, we don't want that. That's the thing that has caused all the problems throughout recent history. Let's go back into the late 1600s, Bank of England, right? From the time of the Bank of England, let's take the Bank of England model all the way through to today. That's been the problem. The banks run that way. You don't want that to happen. You want the customer to own that gold at all times. When he deposits that gold into the depository, it's still Mr. Jones's or Russia's, India, whatever the customer may be, that gold. And then transactions occur digitally, electronically, from Jones to Smith, from India to Russia, vice versa, in which the ownership of those units changes hands in the accounting system. But there's no other thing that is backed by gold. The electronic digits are not backed by gold. They're an accounting. When people talk about currency historically, at least in the United States, it was a thing we had Federal Reserve do. We had Federal Reserve notes that were redeemable under the statute in gold or lawful money by the banks and then ultimately by the Treasury. So you had the actual money, something different from this thing that most people treated as currency and then loosely treated as money, and that was the backing system. And it worked as a federal structure in the United States because the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, each of which could generate its own Federal Reserve notes, were all within one legal system. And they were all subject to the same controls. So the internationalization of this concept raises that question, the ability of one of the national participants to, in some senses, opt out because there is no real control mechanism. Remember, you had an international gold standard with all sorts of different currencies. You had the franc, the pound, the U.S. dollar, probably the Russian ruble when the czars were in control. And they were all different weights of gold reified in a particular coin. British sovereign, French franc, U.S. $20 piece. And that system worked for a while, except that what happened? National interests in terms of trade relationships interfered, and so you had currency wars, or conflicts, or some call them wars, but conflicts. And there were international. I mean, the big one was the international settlements at the turn of the 20th century to try and create an international gold system. And eventually it failed, and the only reason that the Federal Reserve came out of this smelling like a rose was because the United States was never bombed in World War II, right? I mean, we came out of World War II, the one major country with a huge industrial base. We had won the war. We had never been, other than some outlying territories, Alaska and Hawaii, Guam, whatever. We had suffered no damage in the war, physical damage in the war. All right, so you look at this present system, and what are they trying to do? The picture that comes to my mind is it's going to look like the pre-1933 Federal Reserve system, except they're countries in it instead of Federal Reserve regional banks. And they're going to have some kind of backing, the ultimate thing that some institution will pay, or at least be liable to pay, will be gold. And then all of the countries will then, unlike the international gold standard of the early 20th century, but like the Federal Reserve, all of the countries will be using the same digital accounting unit. And people will look at that accounting unit and say, that's the currency, that's the money, and it's backed by the gold, without realizing that, wait a minute, that was always the problem of these kinds of systems. That people would think of this accounting unit as the money, and sometimes that accounting unit, you could get it reified in something other than gold, a paper Federal Reserve note, all right, national bank note earlier on in our system. And people would treat that somehow as the money, and that they called it currency, right? Or, in some instances, people would simply treat the checks, these transfer devices that you had, other than banknotes, as the money. Remember, there was a time when I was young, the checks were endorsed on the back by the whole series of people. I'd pay a check to Jones. Jones would endorse it to Smith. Smith would endorse it to Richards, whatever. There might be 4 or 5 signatures on the back of that check. That check was passing in some way as a kind of currency, second level or third level currency, right? So people get fooled by this, and they don't realize, wait a minute, these things are simply accounting devices. The bookkeeping entries. The bookkeeping entry is not the money. The money is this real thing that I can get in my hand. If I can't get that in my hand, I have a problem in this system. So that's the next question. Is if they call it gold-backed under the Federal Reserve analogy that I'm making here, people pre-1933 could literally get their hands on the backing. If the Federal Reserve note was not paid at the Federal Reserve Bank, it could always be taken to the Treasury, and there was a legal right for a certain amount of gold in redemption of a certain amount of Federal Reserve note dollars. And so that's another question in this system. That was the pre-1933 Federal Reserve. Is this going to look like that, in the sense that all of the citizens within these various countries who are participants in this international system will at some point have a legal right to obtain physical control of the backing of the gold that's there? Or is this gold simply going to be some kind of fictional, not even a promise to pay, but sort of a physical hostage, in the sense that, yeah, we have all this gold and therefore our currency is stable, to which I'd say, well, how can I get my hands on the gold? If I don't think it's that stable, how do I get my hands on the gold? And if there's no guaranteed way for me to get my hands on the gold, then good luck. Sayonara, I'm not going to buy into that kind of a system. It's another phony operation. Now, how would they do that, in my view, to make it a stable and honest system? Take the United States as an example, because then we'd all be in the same legal system. And that's the problem with these international agreements. What is a legal system that enforces the obligations of the members of whatever group you set up, whatever operation you set up? Take the United States as an example. We could have in each state a state gold depository run by the Treasury of each state. And the gold in that depository would be owned by the customers. And those customers might be public entities. The state treasury itself might own gold. It might be mom and pop kettle running a small grocery store in some rural town, whatever. The currency, the money, would be some physical amount of gold, let's say the Troy grain. The system would be, quote-unquote, digital, because 99.9999% of the transactions would occur electronically. The gold would usually never leave the depository. In fact, more would probably enter than would ever leave. But Ma and Pa Kettle, going right down to the lowest level of the economy, Ma and Pa Kettle would have a legal right to receive physically the amount of gold they had in their account. Right? The ownership interest could be transferred back and forth digitally, but Ma and Pa Kettle could come to the window at some point, whatever the window would be, and we say, we want our gold, and they would deliver to you, or to them, they would deliver a certain weight of gold. Okay? Now, that's the ultimately honest system. There's no way that you can play games of inflation or deflation, increase, decrease the money supply, because there's really no way that you're going to destroy the gold. I suppose some gold could go out of that system, go into jewelry and industrial use or what have you. All right? But they can't play the games that have always been played by banks and treasuries in a fictitious creation of money. All right?
In such a system where you want to have no debasement by inflation, etc., would the currency units be properly expressed simply as a weight of gold, such as you were saying, like a Troy grain of gold? That's the actual unit.
Yeah, that's what all the transactions would be, in grains of gold.
And the moment you introduce another intermediary, you introduce the camel's nose under the tent, that you can start debasing that unit in terms of.
Yeah, that was always my view of this was that was always the intent of introducing these intermediaries. Because remember, the banks in the old days, when we had a kind of a frontier banking system, where they were all generating their own notes. That was the game they played, was fractional reserve banking. They issued more notes than they had gold in reserve. And they were always speculating on the stability of the local economy, if you will, because how does a bank make money? Well, it makes money by lending. So it would take somebody's deposits in let's call it a checking account today. It would take 10% of that, keep that on reserve, and loan out the other 90%, in the hopes that the check holders, or the people that had access to those checking accounts, would not withdraw too much money from the bank at one time, at which point the bank would find itself insolvent. You had what we call bank runs, right? People realized, wait a minute, it's not all there. Well, it was never all there, thank you, Mr. and Mrs. America. It was never all there in the fractional reserve system. But you had enough confidence in the banks that they would always be able to pay when you wrote that check. And then when it was realized, well, wait a minute, that's not actually going to happen, because the banks are overextended, they made bad loans or whatever. The people, they were good loans at one time, but the people to which they loaned the money are not now capable of paying it back. All of a sudden, the depositors realized it's not there, and they ran to the bank to be the first one in line to get what was left. And so you had this whole series of runs that were going on through the 19th century, and that was supposed to be cured by the national banking system, a bunch of little cartels. And then that didn't work, and so you created the big cartel, the Federal Reserve System, and that didn't work because it collapsed in 1933. But fortunately for the United States, we weren't bombed to the extent that Germany and Japan and Russia and so forth were bombed. And we came out of World War II with this thing called the Federal Reserve System, which still had some credibility up until 1973. Okay, after 1973, all bets were off. And also that they were using the Federal Reserve System for international political purposes as well. So here we have these other countries saying, no, we don't want to participate in this fraud anymore, so we're going to set up a system that actually has a gold anchor to it. And all I say is, well, if you don't do it this other way, all you're doing is creating an international system that looks like pre-1933 U.S. banking structure, the pre-1933 Federal Reserve System, without the stability of the Federal Reserve System pre-1933, that all of the regional banks were in the same legal system. They're all subject to the same legal controls. So that's, as I said earlier, that's one of the initial problems here. I look at this, can you set this thing up? All right, it's going to be the pre-1933 Federal Reserve redeemable currency, and the currency is now going to be some digital unit. Wonderful. What happens when one of these countries decides to play games?
Miles Franklin Precious Metals is one of America's oldest and most trusted bullion dealers. Miles Franklin is A+ rated and accredited by the Better Business Bureau, licensed and bonded, and has 0 complaints ever registered. Here at Liberty and Finance, we are licensed brokers with Miles Franklin. To order, simply call us, discuss your needs, and we can let you know our live inventory, prices, and availability, and lock in your order over the phone. Once your order is locked, the price is held for you regardless of market fluctuations, and the metals are reserved for you awaiting your settled payment. Within 1 business day of ordering, you will receive an email invoice detailing the order and payment instructions. Miles Franklin accepts payments by bank wire, ACH or electronic check, money order, check mailed priority mail, and cryptocurrency. The fastest forms of payment are bank wire and cryptocurrency. Upon settled payment, metals will ship out within 3 to 5 business days. You will receive tracking information via email. Domestic shipping charges are $15 for any order under 500 ounces of silver or 10 ounces of gold. For orders larger than that, domestic shipping is free. The package will be boxed, fully insured, and labeled discreetly, with no indication of the contents inside. For your privacy, the name Miles Franklin will not even be on the package. To talk to myself, Kaiser, my brother Elijah, or my father Dunnigan, call 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237.